You've heard of the Pilgrims. You've probably heard of Columbus. But neither of those is actually the founding story of the United States. Not the real one. The ugly one. The one that almost didn't happen. The real story starts in Virginia, in the summer of 1607, with 104 English men and boys who landed on a swampy peninsula, named it Jamestown, and began dying almost immediately. Disease, starvation, arrows, bad water, worse leadership. Within 3 years, out of roughly 500 colonists who had come through those gates, fewer than 60 were still alive. And those 60 had eaten things that took centuries to admit out loud, just to make it to spring. Here's the part that should stop you cold. Even those 60 almost didn't make it. By June of 1610, they had given up. They had boarded their boats, abandoned the fort, and were already moving downriver toward the Atlantic and home. The first permanent English settlement in America was finished. Over. Done. And then, 3 days later, 3 days, a fleet appeared on the horizon carrying the new governor, fresh troops, and enough supplies to start over. 3 days in either direction, and there is no British America, no 13 colonies, no Declaration of Independence, no United States. Everything that came after, the Revolution, the Constitution, the whole 400-year story, balanced on the gap between the boats that were leaving and the sails that were coming. This is that story. Not the version with the heroic founding fathers and the inevitable destiny. The version with the starvation and the cannibalism and the girl who was 11 years old when she became part of history, and the chain of disasters that somehow, improbably, produced the country you're living in right now. Hit subscribe. New videos every single day. And this rabbit hole goes much deeper than one video. Drop your city in the comments. Seriously, I want to see how far this reaches. Now, let's go back to where it actually started. The year is 1606, and in London, a group of wealthy merchants and aristocrats have a plan. They've formed something called the Virginia Company, and the pitch is irresistible. There's a continent over there, across the Atlantic, sitting there like a prize waiting to be claimed. The Spanish have been mining gold and silver out of their American colonies for 100 years, sending ships back loaded to the waterline with treasure. England has been watching, hungry and a little desperate, wondering when it gets its turn. The Virginia Company's answer is a joint stock company, essentially the world's first venture capital fund for colonization. Investors buy in, a colony gets planted, the gold and the trade goods and the timber and the furs start flowing back, everyone gets rich. Clean, simple, elegant. The kind of plan that makes perfect sense if you've never spent a winter on the James River. What the Virginia Company wanted from their colonists was gold. Specifically, they wanted someone to find it quickly, get it onto ships, and get those ships back to London before the investors started asking uncomfortable questions. The men they sent to accomplish this were, to put it gently, not exactly tailored for the task. Out of the original 104 colonists who boarded those 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, a significant number were gentlemen. That word meant something very specific in early 17th century England. It meant men who did not perform manual labor, men who considered physical work beneath their station, men who would sooner die than be caught digging in the dirt. Reader, many of them did die. The rest of the crew were a mixed bag: craftsmen, some soldiers, a few laborers. What they didn't have was farmers. What they didn't have was anyone with experience building a settlement in a wilderness. What they didn't have, when you added it all up, was a plan for what to do when the gold didn't materialize in the first week. The company's instructions to the colonists were sealed in a box that couldn't be opened until they landed. Inside, orders naming a 7-man council to govern the colony and a list of priorities. Find gold. Establish trade with the natives. Find a passage to the Pacific Ocean. The instructions said almost nothing about food. And one more name was on that council list when the box was opened. A name that half the men on those ships had already decided they hated. John Smith. Smith was 27 years old and had already lived more lives than most men manage in a full century. Born the son of a farmer in Lincolnshire, he'd gone off to fight in the Dutch wars as a teenager, gotten shipwrecked in the Mediterranean, sold into slavery in the Ottoman Empire, killed his master with a threshing flail, escaped across the Russian steppe, been commissioned as a captain in the Transylvanian army, survived a cavalry charge, and somehow ended up back in England, looking for his next adventure. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of man you'd want on a ship heading into the unknown. He was also loud, low-born, endlessly opinionated, and absolutely incapable of pretending that the gentlemen around him were as capable as they believed themselves to be. By the time the ships were halfway across the Atlantic, the gentleman had decided Smith was dangerously full of himself and had him clapped in chains on charges of plotting mutiny. He spent much of the voyage in the ship's hold, which is, when you think about it, one of history's great acts of self-defeating stupidity. The most competent man on the expedition locked up so he couldn't cause trouble, while the incompetent men argued over who was in charge. They crossed in 4 months. Storms, scurvy, the endless grey hostility of the Atlantic. Then, in late April of 1607, the coast of Virginia appeared out of the haze. Lush, green, startlingly beautiful. The men who hadn't died on the crossing crowded the rails and stared. George Percy, one of the gentlemen, wrote that the land was covered in fair meadows and tall trees, with fresh waters running through the woods that nearly overwhelmed him at first sight. Oysters and mussels lay on the ground thick as cobblestones. Turkeys strutted through the undergrowth. The James River sparkled in the spring light. It looked like paradise. It was, in fact, a trap. But it would take them a little while to figure that out. They chose their site badly. Almost comically badly, in retrospect. The little peninsula they selected jutted out into the James River at a point that seemed defensible, and defensible was the only thing they were thinking about. The Spanish knew about this expedition. The Spanish had been raiding the Virginia coast for decades, and the English settlers had been warned that a Spanish fleet might come for them. So, a peninsula, surrounded on 3 sides by water. Easy to see trouble coming. Perfect. What they didn't think hard enough about was the water itself. The James River at that location was brackish, half salt, half fresh, and for much of the year, essentially undrinkable. The ground was marshy, swampy, alive with mosquitoes in quantities that the English had no reference for. The peninsula was low and flat and prone to flooding. There was almost no game on it. Whatever you were going to eat, you were going to have to trade for it or grow it. Growing things takes time. Trading requires trust. And the people they needed to trade with, the Powhatan Confederacy, the powerful network of Algonquian-speaking tribes that controlled all of Tidewater, Virginia, were watching these strange, pale men, with their steel and their cannon, with a wariness that was entirely justified by everything that had come before. Let's be clear about who the Powhatan were, because this story cannot be told honestly without them. The Powhatan Confederacy was not a collection of scattered tribes barely scraping by. It was an organized, sophisticated political entity. 30-some tribes under the authority of a paramount chief whose name was Wahun Seneca, though the English called him Powhatan after his tribe. His territory stretched from the fall line of the rivers down to Chesapeake Bay, and he governed it with a combination of military power and diplomatic skill that the English never fully appreciated. He had seen outsiders before. Spanish missionaries had tried to plant a colony not far from here and had been driven out. He understood, with a clarity that the English lacked, that these newcomers were something different from traders or explorers. They had come to stay. The question for Powhatan was what to do about that. In the first weeks, the Powhatans probed. A group of warriors attacked the colonists almost immediately after landing, killing 2 men. Then, just as suddenly, they switched to friendliness, bringing food, offering to trade, sending messengers. Powhatan's strategy was not simple hostility. It was something more subtle. He wanted to bring these newcomers under his authority, to make them one more tributary group in his Confederacy, to use their weapons and trade goods for his own political advantage. He didn't want to destroy Jamestown. He wanted to control it. That calculation would change. But in those first weeks of May 1607, the English didn't know any of that. They just knew they were building a fort as fast as they possibly could. The fort went up in a matter of weeks, a triangular palisade of sharpened logs with a church and a storehouse and some crude huts inside. It was small, cramped, hot in the Virginia summer in ways that made England's worst heat waves feel like a brisk autumn morning. And then the summer arrived in full force, and it started killing people. Malaria came first. The mosquitoes rising off the James River in clouds every evening were carrying it, and the English had no idea what malaria was or how to fight it. They called it the ague, the shakes, the fever, the alternating chills and sweating. Men who were fine on Monday were delirious on Tuesday and dead on Thursday. Typhoid followed, dysentery, diseases that bloom in contaminated water, and the only water they had was the brackish river. By August, men were dying faster than they could be buried. By September, half of the original 104 were gone. The men who survived moved through the fort like ghosts, too weak to work, too frightened to think clearly. The food supplies they'd brought from England were running out, spoiled by the crossing, consumed more quickly than planned, and nobody had planted enough crops because the gentlemen didn't plant crops, and the laborers were sick. Powhatan's people still came with food sometimes. Without that food, the colony would already have been a mass grave. And then, in the middle of all this, John Smith finally got out of chains. Here's the thing about John Smith that the official histories sometimes miss. He wasn't a hero in the conventional sense. He wasn't particularly likable. He was arrogant, self-promoting, and capable of a ruthlessness that would make most people uncomfortable. He used the threat of violence freely in his dealings with the Powhatans, essentially extorting corn from villages that weren't eager to part with it. He played political games with a shameless skill that his colleagues both admired and resented. He was, in the fullest sense of the word, a survivor. And in the autumn of 1607, Jamestown needed a survivor more than it needed anything else. Once released from chains, partly because the council recognized they needed him, and partly because the colony's original president, Edward Wingfield, had been deposed for hoarding food for himself, Smith threw himself into the problem with the focused energy of a man who has decided not to die today. He organized the remaining able-bodied men into work parties. He personally led expeditions up the rivers to trade for corn. He came back with hundreds of bushels when everyone else came back empty-handed or not at all. He went to Powhatan's villages and negotiated with a combination of charm and barely veiled threat that somehow, improbably, worked. He also posted the work rules that would become famous. He who shall not work shall not eat. No exceptions, gentlemen included. You have to understand what a radical statement that was. In early 17th century England, physical labor was for the lower classes. The gentlemen had paid their way onto this expedition partly on the expectation that they would be administrators, not farmers. Smith was essentially telling the entire social hierarchy of England to go to hell, because the social hierarchy of England did not function when everyone was starving. The gentlemen were furious. They were also, gradually and grudgingly, fed. Smith's approach kept the colony alive through the winter of 1607 and into 1608. Barely. The margin was always terrifyingly thin. A bad trade negotiation, a disease outbreak, a few more weeks without supply ships from England, and it would have been over. But it held. And then December came, and Smith went exploring, and everything got strange. He was following the Chickahominy River, pushing deeper into territory no English person had ever seen, when the warriors found him. Smith had separated from his main party, probably unwisely, and was moving through the swamp with only 2 companions when Powhatan's brother, Opechancanough, appeared at the head of a hunting party that quickly became something else. Smith's 2 companions were killed. He himself was taken captive. Not killed, which was interesting, which meant something, though he didn't know what yet. What followed was weeks of travel. Village after village, Opechancanough parading his prize through the Powhatan Confederacy, displaying this strange Englishman who spoke enough of their language to be useful, who carried weapons that could kill from a distance. They fed him well. They watched him carefully. They asked him questions he did his best to answer. And eventually they brought him to the place that mattered, Werowocomoco, Powhatan's capital, on the York River. The paramount chief was sitting on a kind of throne, a raised platform covered in skins, surrounded by advisors and warriors. He was a big man, at least 60 years old, with an air of absolute authority that Smith recognized immediately, the body language of someone who has never, ever been told no. 200 people were arranged around the room. Fires burned. The ceremony unfolded. Smith was made to lay on 2 flat stones. Warriors stood over him with clubs. The message was clear. This could end any number of ways, and Powhatan was going to decide which. And then a girl ran in. She was about 11 years old, and her name was Matoaka, though everyone called her by her nickname, Pocahontas, which meant something like playful one. She was Powhatan's favorite daughter, bright and curious, completely unintimidated by any of this. She threw herself between Smith and the clubs, put her head next to his, and declared, by this gesture and by whatever she said to her father, that this man was not to die. Powhatan accepted her intervention. Smith was released. He was told he was now a werowance, a subordinate chief under Powhatan's authority. He was sent back to Jamestown with an escort. Now, that story comes directly from John Smith himself, a man who was famously self-aggrandizing, who had every incentive to write himself as the hero of every scene. Historians have argued for centuries about what actually happened in that room. Some think the whole execution rescue sequence was a ritual of adoption, a formal ceremony that Smith didn't understand, but that Powhatan used to symbolically make him a subject. Others think Smith invented the dramatic rescue years later. His first account of being captured, written in 1608, doesn't mention Pocahontas saving him at all. The dramatic rescue appears only in his later writings, conveniently updated when Pocahontas arrived in London and he needed a good story. What's almost certainly true is this. A young girl named Matoaka did play some kind of role in whatever happened between Smith and Powhatan that December. She would go on to bring food to Jamestown during the lean months. She would warn Smith of at least one assassination plot. She would become, against all odds and through experiences that were often brutal, one of the most significant figures in early American history. But she was 11 years old, and the founding story of the United States should not rest on the shoulders of an 11-year-old girl doing the work that grown men were too proud or too frightened to do themselves. Smith came back to Jamestown, and for about a year, things were almost almost manageable. 1608 was the year of impossible juggling. Supply ships arrived from England in January, Captain Christopher Newport sailing in with a fresh batch of colonists and badly needed food. Days after he landed, the fort caught fire. The conflagration tore through the wooden structures and destroyed almost everything the colonists had accumulated. Food stores, equipment, tools, the crude shelter that had kept them alive through the worst of the winter. They watched it burn and could do almost nothing. Newport spent months rebuilding. He also spent months following the Virginia Company's instructions to look for gold, which predictably produced no gold, because there wasn't any gold. There was timber, there were furs, there was the possibility of trade, but the Virginia Company in London wanted gold, and so Newport loaded his ships with iron pyrite, fool's gold, and sailed for home. Smith was not impressed. He wrote the Virginia Company a letter that managed to be both brilliantly insightful and spectacularly undiplomatic. The letter of a man who has been in Virginia and knows what it actually is, writing to investors who have never left London and refuse to understand. He told them they were sending the wrong people. He told them they needed craftsmen and farmers, not gentlemen looking for gold. He told them that if they kept sending ships full of mouths without enough food to match, the colony was going to die. The Virginia Company did not enjoy receiving this letter. They also didn't take the advice. In September of 1608, Smith was elected president of the council and threw himself into building something sustainable. He expanded the fort. He organized crop planting. He led a trading expedition up the James River that returned with hundreds of bushels of corn. He kept the gentlemen working through sheer force of personality and the occasional credible threat of violence. Pocahontas was a regular visitor during this period, carrying messages from her father, accompanying trade delegations, and apparently just hanging around, fascinated by this strange new world that had parked itself on her people's land. She helped negotiate prisoner exchanges. She was observed doing cartwheels through the fort with the English boys. She and Smith were teaching each other their languages. We know this because his surviving notes include phrases in Algonquian, with notations like, Pocahontas says, tell her to bring 3 baskets. In the middle of everything, these two human beings were doing what humans do when they meet across a language barrier, trying to understand each other, one word at a time. It was almost peaceful, almost sustainable. And then 1609 arrived and pulled everything apart. The Virginia Company, back in London, had been watching their investment fail to produce returns for 2 years. The solution they arrived at was more colonists, more supplies, bigger ships, a new charter, new leadership, a fresh start at larger scale. They would overwhelm the problem with resources. The third supply fleet set sail in the summer of 1609. 9 ships, over 500 men, women, and children, and enough supplies to keep a colony going through the winter. It was the biggest English expedition to the New World yet attempted. The flagship was the Sea Venture, a massive, newly built vessel carrying the expedition's top leadership, including the incoming governor, Sir Thomas Gates, Admiral George Somers, and Captain Christopher Newport. The fleet hit a hurricane somewhere in the Atlantic. Not a bad storm, a hurricane. A wall of water and wind that scattered the 9 ships across hundreds of miles of ocean and drove the Sea Venture far off course before finally beaching it on the shores of Bermuda, an island with no connection to the Virginia mission whatsoever. Gates, Somers, and Newport would spend the next 10 months on Bermuda, building 2 new ships from the wreckage, before eventually making it to Virginia. 7 of the 9 ships did make it to Jamestown. They arrived in August of 1609, battered and low on supplies, carrying 300 new colonists. 300 people who arrived with hungry stomachs and inadequate food stores, looking at a fort already stretched beyond its limits. Smith looked at this situation and saw the disaster coming. He didn't stay to watch it unfold. He couldn't. In early October, a bag of gunpowder exploded near his belt while he was on a boat. The burns covered his hip and thigh, and the colony had nothing that could treat wounds like that. Newport's ships were still in the harbor, preparing to return to England. Smith's colleagues, several of whom had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, helped him onto one of those ships. John Smith left Jamestown on a stretcher, in agony, never to return. He would live for another 2 decades, write extensively about Virginia, and promote the colonization of New England with that same restless, obsessive energy. But he never came back to the place he'd saved. And the place he'd saved, without him, was about to fall apart in ways that made everything that came before look gentle. The man left in charge was George Percy, a nobleman, brother to the Earl of Northumberland, and a witness to everything from the very beginning. He wrote about all of it with a raw, almost compulsive honesty that makes his accounts some of the most important documents of the early colonial period. The deaths, the desperation, the moral collapse, recorded with the flat prose of a man who has run out of ways to be shocked. Percy was not Smith. He knew it. Everyone knew it. And beyond the question of leadership, there was a more immediate problem. The relationship with Powhatan, carefully maintained by Smith through a combination of trade, threat, and personal connection built across the language barrier, collapsed almost immediately after Smith's departure. Powhatan had watched these newcomers for 2 years. He'd seen them take his people's corn, threaten his villages, try to impose their authority on his Confederacy. He'd tolerated Smith because Smith was at least predictable. The new leadership was neither. Powhatan made a decision. He sent word to his warriors. No English person was to leave the fort alive. Not to hunt, not to fish, not to gather wood. Anyone who crossed the palisade walls and went into the Virginia forest was to be killed. Any livestock found outside was to be taken or slaughtered. It was, in military terms, a siege. Powhatan didn't need to attack the fort directly. He just needed to wait. The fort would do his work for him. Inside those walls, the dying started. Percy counted what food they had and did the grim arithmetic. Half a small can of grain per person per day, barely enough to last them halfway through winter. Outside, the warriors waited. Inside, people weakened. The diseases that bloom when humans are crowded together and underfed, dysentery, typhoid, scurvy, moved through the fort like fire through dry grass. Small parties crept into the forest to find food. Any food. Roots, berries, whatever might sustain life. The warriors found them. Percy recorded that many were cut off and slain before they could return. They ate the horses that had been brought over on the August ships, slaughtered and consumed down to the bones. They ate the dogs and cats that had been living inside the fort. They boiled leather, boots, belts, the horse traces, into something that could be swallowed if not exactly digested. They ate rats. They ate snakes. They ate things that no one had names for. And then they ate each other. The forensic evidence came to light in 2012 when archaeologists excavating a cellar at Jamestown found bones deposited around 1610. Among the animal remains and artifacts, the stirrups, the bridle fittings, the useless relics of horses long since consumed, were human bones. A partial skull, a right shin bone. The marks were unmistakable to anyone trained to read them. Multiple chop marks to the back of the skull, 4 distinct cuts to the forehead, cut marks on the shin bone consistent with someone trying to access the marrow inside. The bones belonged to a girl, probably around 14 years old. The archaeologist named her Jane. Jane is the physical proof of what Percy had described in writing, that the colonists of Jamestown consumed the dead. They dug up graves, they butchered bodies. Percy wrote of people licking up blood that had fallen from their weakened companions. He recorded the case of a man who killed his pregnant wife, salted her flesh, and had eaten most of her before the authorities discovered what he'd done. The man was executed. His wife was beyond any justice or mercy. Percy calls it simply, quote, 3, just that. No flourishes, as if the words themselves have been worn smooth by everything they've had to carry. 500 people had entered that winter. Fewer than 60 were still breathing when the snow melted and the Virginia spring pushed back through the mud. Not 60%, not 1 in 10, 1 in 8. Imagine filling a major NFL stadium. Then imagine walking back in after 12 weeks and finding one section, maybe the cheap seats behind one end zone, still occupied. Everyone else gone. That's the starving time. In May of 1610, 2 small boats appeared on the James River. They had come from Bermuda, and the men on them were survivors of the Sea Venture wreck, the flagship swallowed by the hurricane the previous summer. Governor-designate Thomas Gates was among them, along with about 150 others, sailing in 2 small vessels built from Bermudian cedar and Sea Venture salvage. They had spent 10 months on Bermuda, which turned out to be lush and pleasant compared to Jamestown. They had eaten well. They were optimistic in the way that people are optimistic when they've survived a dramatic shipwreck and are finally arriving at their destination. They were not prepared for what they found. Gates sailed into the fort and stood in the silence. The palisade walls were still standing, mostly. The gates hung off their hinges. The houses had been stripped for firewood or burned outright because the people inside were too weak to walk to the forest. The survivors who moved through the ruins were skeletal, hollow-eyed, barely recognizable as the people they had been. The ground inside the fort was a graveyard. Gates assessed the situation. He looked at the supplies he'd brought from Bermuda. Not much. They'd been at sea for weeks. He looked at the survivors. He ran every calculation available to him. He called them together and told them the truth. They were abandoning Jamestown. They would sail downriver to the Chesapeake Bay, try to catch a ride to Newfoundland with the fishing fleet, and from there, eventually, back to England. Virginia was finished. The dream was over. They buried what they could not carry. They spiked the cannons. They left the gates open. There was no one left to guard them against. On June 7th, they loaded onto boats and began moving downriver. The James River is wide and slow at Jamestown. They passed Point Comfort, where a small outpost had held through the winter in slightly better condition than the fort. They kept moving. Open water ahead. England somewhere beyond the horizon. Impossibly far, but suddenly, achingly real. The James River moves slowly here, wide and flat and brown, flanked by marsh grass and cypress. It doesn't rush toward the bay. It eases into it, the way exhausted things ease toward rest. The boats carrying the survivors were doing the same thing on that June morning in 1610. Not racing for escape, just moving, the way people move when the fight has finally gone out of them. There was one stop left before open water, a small outpost called Point Comfort, near the mouth of the river, where a handful of men had spent the winter in slightly better shape than the fort. As Gates's boats pulled up, those men came down to the shore. They'd seen something. Sails. Not one sail, a fleet. Still far off, still just shapes on the water, but moving upriver with purpose. Flying English colors. Flying the colors of London. The Virginia Company had not forgotten they existed. Gates sent a small boat ahead to investigate. It came back with news that changed everything. Lord de la Warr, newly appointed governor of Virginia for life, was in that fleet. He had 3 ships, soldiers, supplies, orders from the Virginia Company to declare martial law, rebuild the colony, and make the whole thing work by force of will, if nothing else. He had departed England in March, crossed the Atlantic, and arrived at the mouth of the James River on June 10, 1610, 3 days after Gates's flotilla had abandoned Jamestown. 3 days. 3 days is a bad headwind, a loose rigging rope, a navigator who slept in. 3 days in either direction, and British America never happens. Gates sailed back upriver to meet him. De la Warr was a nobleman, born into one of England's oldest families, closely connected to the Earl of Essex, veteran of the Irish Wars, investor in the Virginia Company before he became its instrument. He was not a man accustomed to failure, and he was not a man who accepted other people's surrender as a reason to give up. He listened to Gates' account of the starving time with the attention of someone cataloging intelligence, not someone absorbing tragedy. He asked questions. He assessed. And when Gates was finished, de la Warr gave his answer. "Turn the boats around. You're going back." There are accounts of what the survivors said when they heard this. Some were genuinely relieved, desperate to have someone else make the decision, to have authority descend from above and relieve them of the weight of their own catastrophe. Others were not. Percy's writing hints at men who had seen too much, who had eaten things they could never uneat, who wanted nothing more than the grey Atlantic between them and the Virginia shore. For those men, de la Warr's order wasn't salvation. It was a sentence. They went back anyway. De la Warr's fleet moved upriver and anchored below the fort. He came ashore last, not because he was afraid, but because ceremony mattered. The theatrical statement of authority arriving in Virginia needed to be visible and unmistakable to everyone watching. He knelt on the shore and prayed, out loud, long enough for every survivor in the fort to hear him. Then he stood and walked through the gates. What he saw in that fort clearly moved him. He later wrote about it. He also did not let it slow him down. Within days, martial law was declared. Within weeks, he'd organized work parties and set them rebuilding. Fortifications repaired, crops planted, real crops, in real soil, with enough supervision to ensure they actually got tended. Fresh supplies sent for from England and Bermuda. Word delivered to Powhatan that Virginia was under new management and the English were not leaving. Powhatan, for his part, was furious. He had waited all winter. He had run a perfect siege. He had watched the English starve and collapse inside their useless fort. And then he had watched them board their boats and start leaving. And he had almost won. Almost driven them off the continent entirely. And then these new ships had arrived. And now there were English soldiers burning Powhatan villages along the river in retaliation, and the whole calculation had reversed. The war between the Powhatan Confederacy and the Virginia colony would continue, in various forms, for years. It would be brutal on both sides and merciless on neither. De la Warr himself authorized atrocities, village burnings, the killing of women and children, the taking of captives. The martial law he imposed on the colonists was no gentle thing either. Men were executed for desertion, for stealing food, for infractions that in peacetime would have earned a fine. Virginia in 1610 and 1611 was a military occupation, not a colony in any civilian sense, but it functioned. Virginia survived. The flag stayed up. The fort held. And by the time de la Warr himself fell ill in the spring of 1611, racked by fever, cramps, gout, and dysentery, and sailed back to England to recover, the colony was, for the first time, genuinely holding together. He never fully came back. He recovered in England, published a book about his time in Virginia, and spent years trying to return, before dying at sea in 1618 on another voyage to the colony he'd saved. The bay that Captain Samuel Argall named in his honor, Delaware Bay, would eventually give its name to a river, a people, and a state. A strange kind of immortality, having your name on a map. But there are worse legacies. Here's something that doesn't get enough attention. Jamestown's survival, in those first years after De La Warre's arrival, was not the beginning of easy prosperity. It was a grinding, violent, disease-ridden slog during which the mortality rate stayed high, the relationship with the Powhatans remained murderous, and the Virginia Company's investors kept waiting for returns that never came. What saved the colony, ultimately, wasn't military force. It wasn't better leadership, though that helped. What saved Virginia was a weed. Tobacco had been growing in Virginia long before the English arrived. The Powhatan people had been cultivating and using it for generations, for ceremony, for trade, for medicine. The English had known about tobacco since Sir Walter Raleigh had popularized it in the court of Elizabeth I, and they smoked it and found it pleasant. But the Virginia strain was too harsh for European tastes. Nobody was going to get rich selling something that made people cough and wince. And then a man named John Rolfe arrived. Rolfe had been on the sea venture. He'd survived the Bermuda wreck, spent those 10 months on the island, and arrived in Virginia in 1610 with Gates's flotilla, on the very day the colony was rescued from abandonment. He was a quiet man, methodical and observant, with a practical intelligence that expressed itself not in dramatic action, but in patient problem-solving. He looked at the Virginia tobacco and the English market and asked a simple question. What if you could grow a variety that people actually wanted to smoke? He got seeds of a sweeter Caribbean strain. How exactly remains murky, but he got them. He crossbred, he experimented, he paid obsessive attention to soil and curing techniques, and by 1612, he had something. The first shipment of Rolfe's tobacco reached London, and the merchants who tasted it sat up straight. This was the stuff they'd been importing from Spain at enormous cost, paying for the privilege of enriching their enemies. And here it was, growing in Virginia. The Virginia Company had found its cash crop. Within a few years, tobacco was everywhere. Colonists were growing it in every available patch of soil, including, to the exasperation of the authorities, in the streets of Jamestown itself. Ships arrived from England, loaded with new settlers, and left loaded with hogsheads of cured tobacco leaf. The money started flowing. The investors started seeing returns. The whole project, which had nearly died a dozen times in its first 3 years, suddenly had a reason to continue. And John Rolfe, the quiet experimenter, had something else by 1614, a wife. Pocahontas, Matoaka, had not been seen at Jamestown since 1609, when Smith's departure and the beginning of the Anglo-Powhatan War had cut the fragile connection between the fort and the Confederacy. She had married a Powhatan warrior and gone to live in the Potomac region, away from the conflict. She was around 17 when a captain named Samuel Argall found her visiting allies on the Potomac River and made a decision that was either calculated geopolitics or straightforward kidnapping, depending on whose account you believe. He lured her aboard his ship and took her to Jamestown as a hostage. The ransom demand went to Powhatan. Return English prisoners, return stolen weapons, agree to a peace. Powhatan sent back some prisoners and some weapons. He did not send back his daughter. He negotiated, stalled, and eventually, and this is the part that still contains something genuinely heartbreaking, seemed to relinquish her. Whether that was a tactical decision or a political calculation, we can't know. But Matoaka remained in English hands. During her captivity, she was converted to Christianity, given the name Rebecca, and introduced to the widower John Rolfe, who had lost his wife and infant daughter in the Bermuda wreck. Rolfe fell in love with her. He wrote an anguished letter to the governor, wrestling with the theological implications of marrying a native woman, ultimately concluding that love and Christian duty pointed in the same direction. Whether she loved him back is something we cannot know. She left no letters. The historical record of her inner life is entirely filtered through English men who had every reason to present the story in the way that suited English purposes. What we know is that she agreed to marry him. In April of 1614, they were wed at Jamestown Church, with representatives of Powhatan in attendance. The marriage brought the First Anglo-Powhatan War to a close. The English called the resulting peace __quote_for__. It was a peace that rested, in part, on a young woman who had been taken captive, converted from her religion, separated from her family, and given in marriage to a man she barely knew. In 1616, Pocahontas, Rebecca Rolfe now, traveled to London with her husband, their infant son Thomas, and a Powhatan delegation. The Virginia Company sent them as a promotional tool. Here is the civilized native. Here is proof that the Virginia Project has a human face. Here is a reason to invest. She was presented at court. She met King James. She was painted, observed, celebrated, displayed. John Smith, living in England, came to see her. Their meeting, by his account, was charged with old memories and old strangeness. She called him __quote_5__, which may have been a translation of the Powhatan word for a person of respect, or may have been something more personal. We don't know. We'll never know. She died in Gravesend in the spring of 1617, preparing to sail home. She was around 21 years old. Her son, Thomas, was left with English relatives. He eventually returned to Virginia, where his descendants still live today. What her life actually was, what she felt, what she wanted, what she made of the forces that shaped and consumed her, is mostly lost. What survives is what Englishmen wrote about her, which is useful and incomplete, and filtered through centuries of self-serving mythology. The real Matoaka deserves better than the story that was built around her. She always did. By the time she died in England, Jamestown had survived long enough to start becoming something. Not comfortable. Comfortable would take decades, but something. The tobacco was growing. More colonists were arriving. The fort that had nearly been abandoned was expanding into what looked, with some generosity of interpretation, like a real settlement. And in 1619, two things happened that would define everything that came after. The first was the establishment of the House of Burgesses, a representative assembly, the first elected legislative body in England's North American colonies. 22 men met in the Jamestown Church in July of that year and debated laws and policies, their voices carrying in the Virginia summer heat, trying to govern something that had never been governed before. It was imperfect, it was limited, it excluded almost everyone. But it was a beginning.
The idea that the people living in a place should have some say in how that place is run, that idea took one of its first institutional steps in that sweltering church in 1619. The second thing was a ship. It arrived that summer. Dutch, by most accounts, or possibly English, flying a privateer's flag. The details genuinely murky. And it carried cargo. The ship traded some of its cargo for food. The cargo was people. 20 or more African men and women, captured from present-day Angola, taken across the Atlantic in chains, sold at the edge of a continent they'd never seen, to colonists who would put them to work in the tobacco fields. The first permanent English settlement in America. The first elected assembly in English North America.
the first enslaved Africans in English North America. All in the same year, all in the same place, all growing from the same desperate, violent, barely survived foundation of those first 3 winters. Here's the question that sits at the center of all of this, and there's no comfortable answer. What was Jamestown? Was it the founding miracle? The moment English civilization took root in the New World? The first chapter of the story that becomes the Revolution and the Constitution and everything you were taught in school? The heroic survival against impossible odds? Or was it the original wound? The template for what colonization actually looks like, stripped of the heroic language? The place where the patterns that would define American history for 4 centuries were first established. The theft of land, the erasure of the people who were there, the reduction of human beings to property, to labor, to the fuel that made the whole engine run. The honest answer is both, at the same time, inseparably. John Smith was brilliant and brutal and impossible and essential. Matoaka was real and complex and resilient, and the story we tell about her says more about us than it does about her. Powhatan was a sophisticated political leader, trying to protect his people from an invasion that his instincts told him, correctly, would eventually destroy everything he'd built. George Percy sat in a ruined fort and watched his people die, and wrote it all down with unflinching honesty, which is its own kind of courage. The starving time is not a metaphor. It was a real event, experienced by real bodies, that left real bones in the Virginia soil. Bones with cut marks on them. Bones that tell a story that Smith's self-promotional narrative never would. 500 people at the start of winter, fewer than 60 by spring. The math of that has never stopped being staggering. There's a thing that happens when you go this deep into history. When you get past the statues and the founding myths, and the stories that nations tell about themselves to explain why they deserve to exist. You start to see the contingency of everything, the way empires and civilizations and countries are not inevitable, not products of destiny or providence, but accidents. Consequences of small decisions and bad weather, and a fleet that arrived 3 days before it would have been too late. If the sea venture doesn't hit that hurricane, maybe the full expedition arrives in Virginia intact, and the story goes differently. If Smith doesn't get burned, maybe he holds the colony together through the worst of the winter. If Delaware's ships had been delayed by a week, the survivors make open water, and Virginia becomes another Roanoke, a mystery, a footnote, a ghost. Any one of 100 things goes differently, and there is no United States of America. Or there is one, but it speaks Dutch, or French, or Spanish, or in one of the Algonquian languages that were spoken on that shore for thousands of years, before 3 ships appeared out of the Atlantic mist in the spring of 1607. The country that exists today, with all its contradictions, all its arguments about what it is and who it's for and what it owes and what it's done, was not written in the stars. It was made. Made by specific people, making specific decisions, under pressures most of them didn't understand and couldn't control. Made by Smith's stubbornness, and Matoaka's curiosity, and Percy's honesty, and Delaware's timing, and a hurricane, and the wind that happened to be blowing on the James River on the morning of June 10th, 1610. Made, in part, by hunger, by extremity, by what human beings do when they've been stripped of everything else and are left with nothing but the raw fact of survival. The bones of Jane are in a museum now, in Williamsburg, Virginia. She has a forensic reconstruction, a face around 14 years old, looking out from behind museum glass, with the expression of someone who doesn't quite understand what she's doing there. She didn't choose to be part of history. She was just hungry. And then she was dead. and then 400 years later, she became evidence. She always deserved better than to be evidence. They all did. The survivors who made it to spring, the 440 who didn't. The Powhatan people who watched their world get swallowed by a civilization that had no room for them in it. The African men and women who arrived on that ship in 1619 and never chose to be there at all. History is not a story of winners and losers. It's a story of what actually happened, with all the mess and the luck and the horror and the occasional grace intact. Jamestown is where that story starts for America. Not with the Pilgrims, who came 13 years later and got better press, not with Columbus, who landed a continent away, but here, this swampy peninsula, these few hundred men who mostly died, this impossible winter. This is where it actually began. Not in legend, not in myth. In the mud and the hunger and the people who made it to spring. That's the real founding story of America. And now you know it.